Okay, this is our first of two videos on learning approaches, this one looking at behaviourism and focusing on classical conditioning. So just to note that on the AQA specification, you'll see under learning approaches that behaviourism and social learning theory are both mentioned. At the moment, we're just going to be focusing on behaviourism, so looking at the ideas of classical and operant conditioning, and then later on in the topic, we're going to be looking at social learning theory, focusing on Bandura's research with the Bobo dolls. But for now, just behaviourism and just classical and operant conditioning. So let's start by looking at the key assumptions of behaviourism. So behaviourists, like we see here, Ivan Pavlov, B.F. Skinner, Thorndike, and Watson, were only interested in behaviour that can be observed and measured. So they were rejecting the vagueness of Wundt's method of introspection and only focused on observable events, so i.e. stimuli and responses, and they were interested in the conditions under which learning would be most likely to occur. So they were looking at how organisms respond to stimuli in our environment. And this is known as the stimulus response model of learning. So sometimes behaviourism is referred to as the learning theory for this reason. So behaviourists were interested in rigorous scientific testing under lab conditions using animals. So for the case of Pavlov, he was interested in investigating salivation and classical conditioning in dogs. And for Skinner, he was investigating operant conditioning in rats. Thorndike, cats. And of course, we also had Watson, who was studying little Albert, but was also looking at rats there as well. So really highly scientific lab experiments using animals. You'll hear this phrase tabula rasa often associated with behaviourism. This means blank slate. This is the idea that all behaviour is learned as a response to our environment. So we are born without any complex behaviours. All behaviours, even behaviours as complex as phobias and attachment to our caregivers, is learned as a response of our environment and associating stimuli. And we're looking here at two major forms of learning, classical and operant conditioning. So, Ivan Pavlov, you'll remember from the video, is a Russian physiologist, normally credited with discovering the processes of classical conditioning. So he was investigating the salivation reflex in dogs when he made a serendipitous discovery. So he noticed that the animals not only salivated when food was placed in their mouths, but they were also reacting to stimuli that coincided with the presentation of food. So he noticed that they would salivate whenever they saw their food bowl presented, even if it didn't have food. They would salivate at the sound of the researcher's footsteps, which they had learned to associate with food. So he was interested in really looking at the conditions under which this type of learning was most likely to occur. So he ended up winning the Nobel Prize for his work with salivation in dogs, but at the same time discovered this really important form of learning in animals and in humans as well. So let's have a look at this type of learning, classical conditioning. So a complex definition, but we're going to break it down. So classical conditioning occurs when a response produced naturally by a certain stimulus becomes associated with another stimulus that isn't normally associated with that response, as a result of repeated pairings between the two stimuli. And this is learning via association. So let's just break this down. So all animals, and that includes us as humans, we're born with natural reflexes, such as the response of salivation whenever we're presented with food. So this is made up here of our unconditioned stimulus and our unconditioned response. When other stimuli, for example the bell, are consistently presented with this stimulus and predict its arrival, then eventually just that stimulus alone is enough to produce the response in that organism. And it's at this point we say that the dog has been classically conditioned. So let's have a look at the different elements of classical conditioning here. So we'll start with the unconditioned stimulus. So the natural stimulus in any reflex is referred to as the unconditioned stimulus. So this is something that elicits a natural response. This is something that produces an innate and reflexive response. So in the case of the dog, this is food because it produces the natural response of salivation. So then the unconditioned response is the response to our unconditioned stimulus. In this case, it's salivation to food. Just a trick, just a little note, remember that conditioning means learning. So here in the case of the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response, these are unlearned. This is because they're reflexive, they're innate, they naturally occur without any learning. The neutral stimulus is our stimulus that doesn't produce any natural response. So in the case of Pavlov's experiment, this was the bell. So in the acquisition or the learning phase, the neutral stimulus is paired with our unconditioned stimulus. And it usually is presented immediately before or very shortly before the unconditioned stimulus. So for example, the bell was rang, and then within a couple of seconds, the food was presented. If there's too long a space between the presentation of the neutral and the unconditioned stimulus, then no association will be formed. So after numerous pairings between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the bell and the food, our neutral stimulus now becomes our conditioned stimulus. And this is once learning or conditioning has taken place. So in the case of a conditioned stimulus, this is now a stimulus which you have learned to respond to via association, and it was previously the neutral stimulus. So after enough pairings between the bell and the food, the bell alone is enough to produce a response in the dog. So we have learned, or the dog has learned, to respond to that stimulus. And at that point, when the bell alone produces salivation, that bell becomes a conditioned stimulus. It was previously the neutral stimulus. And the new response that the dog has learned to our conditioned stimulus is known as our conditioned response. So it's the same response as we had before, our unconditioned response. It's still salivation, but this time it's in response to our conditioned stimulus. So this time it's salivation to the bell. Alright, so let's have a look at this in a little bit of a tidy diagram here. We're going to have lots of opportunity to practice using these elements and applying them to new scenarios. But let's have a look. So before conditioning, before learning, our neutral stimulus didn't produce any response in the dog. However, our unconditioned stimulus does naturally produce the reflexive response of salivation in the dog. So during learning, during our acquisition phase, we have the repeated pairing of these two stimuli. Our neutral stimulus, the bell, and our unconditioned stimulus, the meat. And this produces our unconditioned response of salivation. At the point by which the bell alone produces salivation, the bell becomes our conditioned stimulus. It was previously our neutral and now becomes our conditioned stimulus. And the bell produces the conditioned response. So at the point by which the dog is salivating to the bell and not just the food, our salivation becomes our conditioned response in response to our conditioned stimulus, the bell. So this video has looked at Pavlov's experiment with dogs, looking at the processes of classical conditioning, and also looked at the general assumptions of behaviourism, the idea that humans and organisms are born tabula rasa, and all complex behaviour is learned as a response to our environment. The focus on scientific experiments like Pavlov's very controlled research with dogs, and looking at classical conditioning. In the next video, we're going to look at Skinner's research into operant conditioning with rats. Again, very scientific, very empirical evidence that was gathered through experimentation with animals.